Usually, the word bank is associated with an image of people sitting behind desks, processing checks, dispensing cash, and solving customer queries. For the longest period, that is the image we've had. Nowadays, a bank resembles an ATM, a check deposit machine, or if you're more tech savvy, an app on the phone. While the perception of banking undergoes a change in the customer's mind, for most public sector banks, the transition has yet to take place to that extent. On January 30th and 31st, over 1 million bank employees will go on strike for the implementation of the 11th wage settlement. The strike would reinforce the traditional notion of a public sector bank. In 2021-22, the wage bill of private banks increased by 17% compared to the last fiscal year, whereas for the public sector banks, the increase was a little over 6%. But a business standard analysis shows that employee costs at public sector banks accounted for 60% of the total expenditure. The corresponding ratio for the banks, private ones, was 40%. So are employee costs prohibitive for the public sector banks? We talked to experts to understand.
If you look at the data of the last 10 years, the total employees of private banks have increased at a CAGR of 7.6%, while for PSU banks, it rose by 2.5%. Similarly, the employee expenses in the last decade for private banks rose by 15.7%, while for PSU banks, it rose by 10.1%. So both in terms of employee additions and employee expenses, private banks have been growing at a faster pace than PSU banks. Now this is primarily because in the past decade, private players have been eating the market share of PSU banks, and therefore they require a faster employee growth to feed their faster business growth.
An analysis of employee costs as a proportion of total expenditure doesn't present a complete picture. A cost-income comparison shows that disparity. Every rupee spent on wages at public sector banks generated 6.3 rupees in income. The corresponding numbers for private banks were 9.7 rupees in income for every rupee spent on wages. The difference would not be visible at top-level salaries. Public sector banks tend to pay more at lower levels than private sector banks. At the higher levels, the remuneration levels are much higher for private banks. Does that mean that public sector banks need to stop hiring?
If you look at the cost levels at public sector banks vis-a-vis their the employee costs vis-a-vis their overall expenses, that has been higher than private sector banks. Again, if you look at the last decade or so. For public sector banks, it has ranged between 55 and 65%. For private banks, it is 36 to 43%. Again, private sector banks have been more efficient when it comes to lower value-added jobs employing higher technology initiatives and digitization. Going forward, we believe public sector banks can reduce costs by employing similar approaches on the clerical and sub-staff side. But they would need to continue to recruit at the skilled workforce and the senior management level.
Moreover, what about the head-to-tail ratio or the officer to the clerical grade ratio at public sector banks?
If I look at the numbers, we don't see too much of a deterioration in the ratio. Again, over the last decade or so, if I look at the ratio of senior management or officer level staff to sub-staff and clerical staff at public sector banks, that has actually improved from around 0.6 times to 1.1 times. Whereas for private sector banks, again, that has improved. We've seen a much sharper increase from around 3 times to around 19 times. Now, that clearly, again, showcases the greater employment of technology, digitization, automation of private sector banks. Going forward, we believe that this ratio is going to further increase. The proportion of officers will increase further as more and more automation is getting deployed at lower value added jobs. And I think that will, public sector banks are also working on that. And that should the ratio should continue to increase in the days ahead.
PSPs need to take a technological leap to compete with private peers. But can they do much, keeping in view the government's push for inclusive banking?
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.
I am the blue of the limitless sky. I am the inspiration that lets success soar high. I will achieve, I will fly high. I am the I in SBI.
I'm backed by the nation's trusted bank, SBI, the banker to every Indian.